The rain fell in sheets across the colony settlement, turning the red dirt of New Terra into rivers of rust-colored mud. David Chen stood at his kitchen window, watching the storm hammer against the plasteel dome that covered the human outpost. He sipped his coffee and wondered, not for the first time, why he had volunteered for this assignment. 3 years on a frontier world, they had said. Good pay, they had promised. A chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. What they hadn't mentioned was the loneliness, the isolation, the endless stretches of days where nothing happened except the wind and the rain and the distant howl of native creatures he had never seen. The knocking started soft, so soft that David almost missed it over the sound of the storm. Tap, tap, tap. He turned his head, frowning. The settlement had 47 people, and most of them were asleep at this hour. The night shift workers were all at the mining facility, and the day crew wouldn't be up for another 3 hours. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, more insistent now. David set down his coffee and walked to the door of his small prefab housing unit. Through the security panel, he could see nothing but darkness and rain. The motion sensors showed no heat signature at human height, probably just debris blown against the door by the wind. He almost turned away, almost went back to his coffee and his window, and his thoughts about Earth and home, and whether he had made the right choices in life. But something made him look at the security panel again, made him adjust the sensors to scan lower, closer to the ground. There, a small heat signature, low to the ground, moving. David's hand hovered over the door release. Every training protocol screamed at him to call security first. New Terra was home to dozens of species, most of them harmless, but some decidedly not. The colony had strict rules about opening doors to unknown contacts. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking came again, weaker this time. The heat signature on the scanner flickered, dimmed slightly. Whatever was out there was cold, getting colder. David made his decision. He grabbed the stun stick from the wall mount, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The creature at his doorstep was no bigger than a house cat. It looked up at him with eyes that seemed too large for its head, huge and golden and filled with something that looked almost like relief. Its body was covered in scales that shifted through colors even in the dim light, greens and blues and purples that rippled like oil on water. Small wings, no bigger than David's hands, hung limp and bedraggled from its back. It was shivering violently. The creature made a sound, soft and chirping, and then collapsed. David stood frozen for 3 full seconds, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Then training kicked in. He dropped to one knee, reaching for the creature with his free hand. It was barely breathing, its small chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow movements. Its body temperature was far too low. Hypothermia, David realized. This thing was dying from the cold. He scooped it up in both hands, surprised by how light it was, and carried it inside. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing out the storm. David moved quickly to the bathroom, grabbing towels and turning on the heat lamp he used for the few plants he kept alive. He wrapped the creature gently, carefully, trying not to damage the delicate wings. Up close, he could see tiny crystalline patterns in the scales, like frost or stars. The creature's eyes opened again, focusing on him with an intensity that made David's breath catch. There was intelligence there, clear, unmistakable intelligence. This was no simple animal. This was a person. "Hey there," David said softly, knowing the creature probably couldn't understand him, but needing to say something anyway. "You're going to be okay. I've got you." The creature chirped again, a sound that rose and fell with musical quality. Its small clawed hands, each no bigger than David's thumb, reached up and clutched at the towel. The shivering began to ease as warmth seeped back into its body. David sat on the bathroom floor, holding the bundle of towels and watching as color slowly returned to the creature's scales. His mind raced through possibilities. New Terra had native, intelligent species, but they lived far from human settlements. The quarantine protocols strictly forbade contact except under official diplomatic circumstances. If this creature was one of the natives, David was already in violation of about 15 different colony regulations. But he couldn't have left it out in the storm. Regulations or not, he couldn't have let it die on his doorstep. The creature's breathing steadied. Its eyes remained fixed on David's face, studying him with that same intense focus. Slowly, carefully, it lifted one small hand and placed it against David's wrist. The touch was light, almost hesitant. David felt a tingle run through his arm, like static electricity but warmer, more alive. Images flashed through David's mind, not words but concepts, feelings, lost, scared, storm, cold, separated, family. The impressions came rapid fire, overwhelming, and then they were gone. David gasped, pulling back slightly. The creature made a worried sound and withdrew its hand. "No, it's okay," David said, his voice shaky. "I just wasn't expecting that. You can communicate through touch. That's incredible." The creature tilted its head, studying him. Then slowly it reached out again. This time David was ready. The touch came, and with it a flood of images and sensations. He saw a group of creatures like this one, larger, adults perhaps, moving through the air on wings that caught the light. He saw a settlement built into trees that stretched toward the sky, structures that seemed to grow as much as they were built. He saw this small creature, younger, less experienced, trying to follow the adults through a storm and losing sight of them in the wind and rain. And he felt the fear, the desperation, the cold certainty of death approaching. David understood. This was a child, a hatchling, lost and alone, who had somehow made it to the human settlement seeking help. And somehow, impossibly, it had known to knock on a door. "Your family," David said. "They're out there looking for you." The creature's response came through touch again. Yes, maybe, hope, fear. The concepts jumbled together in a way that spoke of a mind still young, still learning to organize its thoughts. David made a decision. "We need to let them know you're safe. We need to get you back to them." But how? The colony had no official contact protocols with the native species. The few researchers who had observed them from a distance reported that they were isolationist, wary of outsiders, protective of their territories. Approaching them could be seen as an act of aggression. And David had no way of knowing where the hatchling's family even was. The creature seemed to sense his uncertainty. It made a series of chirps and trills, sounds that rose and fell with musical complexity. Then it touched David's wrist again, and this time the image was clear. A tall tree, distinctive in its shape, with branches that spread like an umbrella. A landmark, a meeting place. "You know where they might look for you," David said. "You can show me." The creature's scales rippled with colors that David was beginning to recognize as expressions of emotion, happiness, relief, hope. David glanced at the chrono on the wall. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours until the colony woke up and people started asking questions about why he was out in the wilderness. 4 hours to become either a hero or a criminal, depending on how this turned out. He stood up, still holding the bundle of towels with the creature inside. "All right, little one, let's get you ready to travel. And let's hope your family doesn't decide to eat me when I show up." The creature made a sound that, impossibly, seemed almost like laughter. David spent the next hour preparing. He packed supplies, charged his equipment, and sent a carefully worded message to the colony's admin system indicating he was going out for routine atmospheric samples. It wasn't technically a lie. He could grab some samples while he was out there. It just wasn't the whole truth. The creature, which David had started mentally calling Spark because of the way its scales seemed to glow when it was happy, watched him prepare with evident interest. It had recovered quickly from its ordeal, the remarkable resilience of youth showing through. Now wrapped in a warmer, lighter blanket, Spark explored David's small living space with curiosity, touching things gently with those small, clawed hands and chirping questions that David could only partially understand. When Spark touched his collection of photographs from Earth, images of forests and oceans and mountains, the flow of emotion was pure wonder. The hatchling had never seen anything like it. Its own world was beautiful in different ways, but seeing Earth through these images opened its mind to possibilities it had never imagined. David found himself telling Spark about Earth, about humanity, about the long journey through space that had brought people to New Terra. He didn't know how much the creature understood, but it listened with complete attention, its golden eyes never leaving his face. And sometimes when Spark touched his hand, David felt a response. Understanding, connection, the beginning of something that might, one day, be called friendship. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, David sealed his environment suit and prepared to head out. He had fashioned a carrier for Spark, something that would keep the hatchling warm and safe while allowing it to see and direct their path. Spark settled into it without complaint, seeming to understand the necessity. At the door, David paused. This was the moment of no return. Once he stepped outside with Spark, once he headed into the wilderness seeking the native species, he was committing himself to a course of action that could end his career, could end his life, if things went badly. Spark touched his hand through the carrier's opening. The message was simple and clear. Trust, hope, together. David smiled despite his nervousness. Yeah, he said, together. He opened the door and stepped out into the dawn of New Terra, carrying a lost hatchling and the weight of two worlds' futures on his shoulders. The forest beyond the settlement was unlike anything found on Earth. Trees stretched hundreds of feet into the air, their trunks wider than houses, their leaves forming canopies that filtered the early morning light into shades of green and gold. Fungal growths the size of boulders dotted the forest floor, glowing with soft bioluminescence that persisted even into daylight. The air was thick with moisture and the scent of growing things, alien but not unpleasant. David moved carefully, following Spark's directions. The hatchling would chirp and gesture, pointing with one small hand toward landmarks only it could recognize. A tree with a split trunk, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a stream that burbled with water that ran slightly purple from the minerals it carried. They had been walking for 2 hours when David first sensed they were being watched. It was nothing obvious, no sounds, no movement in the canopy above, just a feeling, a prickle at the back of his neck that told him they were no longer alone. His hand moved to the stun stick at his belt, though he hoped desperately he wouldn't need to use it. Spark felt it too. The hatchling made a sound, loud and carrying, a cry that echoed through the forest. It was a call, David realized, a signal. For a long moment, nothing happened. David stood frozen, barely breathing, while Spark called again. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Then, they came. They dropped from the canopy like falling stars, wings spreading at the last moment to catch the air and slow their descent. There were 5 of them, adults, each easily 3 times the size of Spark. Their scales rippled with colors that seemed to shift with emotion. Anger, fear, relief, all mixed together in patterns David couldn't fully read. The largest one landed directly in front of David, close enough that he could feel the wind from its wings. It stood upright, reaching perhaps to David's chest, but its presence seemed to fill the entire clearing. Its eyes, the same golden color as Spark's, but larger and more intense, fixed on David with an expression that could have been curiosity or calculation or the prelude to an attack. Spark made a joyful sound and wriggled in the carrier. David, moving slowly and carefully, opened the carrier and lifted the hatchling out. Spark immediately launched itself toward the large adult, wings flapping awkwardly but enthusiastically. The adult caught Spark in careful arms, holding the hatchling close and making sounds that were simultaneously musical and deeply emotional. The other adults moved closer, surrounding them, touching Spark with gentle hands to reassure themselves that the hatchling was unharmed. And David stood there, watching a family reunion taking place before his eyes, and felt something in his chest tighten. He thought of his own family back on Earth, his parents and his sister, and his niece who he had never met in person because he had chosen to come to the stars. He thought about what it would feel like to lose a child, to search through a storm not knowing if they were alive or dead, and then to find them safe in the arms of a stranger. The large adult turned to him, still holding Spark. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, human and alien, separated by evolution and biology and culture, but connected by something more fundamental: the care for a child, the relief of a crisis averted, the recognition of kindness given and received. The adult moved closer. David fought every instinct that told him to step back, to maintain distance, to protect himself. Instead, he stood his ground and waited. The adult reached out one hand, much larger than Spark's, but similar in structure, and placed it gently on David's arm. The touch sent a cascade of images through David's mind, more complex and controlled than Spark's untrained communications. He saw gratitude, profound and deep. He saw respect. He saw curiosity about this strange being who had saved one of their own. And he saw an invitation. The adult withdrew its hand and gestured toward the forest, towards something deeper within. The meaning was clear even without words. Come, see, learn. David knew he should refuse, knew he should make his excuses and return to the colony before he was missed, knew that every moment he spent here was another regulation violated, another protocol broken. But he also knew that this moment was bigger than regulations, that what was being offered here was something that humanity had searched for among the stars for generations. Not just first contact, but first friendship. Not just meeting another intelligent species, but being invited to understand them. David looked at Spark, still cradled in the adult's arms. The hatchling looked back at him with those huge golden eyes and touched the adult's shoulder. Images flowed between them, and though David couldn't sense them directly, he saw the adult's scales shift to colors he was beginning to recognize. Happiness, agreement, trust. The adult looked at David again and gestured once more toward the forest. This time there was something almost like a smile in its expression. David made his choice. He sent a quick message to the colony system, reporting that he had discovered evidence of native intelligent species presence and was pursuing first contact protocols. It wasn't precisely true. First contact protocols required about 6 levels of authorization he didn't have, but it would buy him time before anyone came looking. Then he followed the adults and Spark into the forest, towards something that might change everything. The settlement was called Skyreach, though David only learned that name later, through patient communication and slowly growing understanding. It was built in and among a grove of the tallest trees David had ever seen, structures that seemed to grow organically from the wood itself, shaped by some art or science he didn't understand. Bridges stretched between the trees, and platforms at various levels created a vertical city that spiraled upward toward the sky. The people, and David was certain now that they were people, not just intelligent creatures, but beings with culture and art and society, were called the Caliph. They were the guardians of these forests, the singers of the sky, the keepers of stories that stretch back generations. All of this David learned slowly, through touches and images and patient attempts at communication. The large adult who had first met him was called something that translated roughly as Wind Whisper in David's mind, a name that seemed to capture both the creature's grace in flight and its calm, thoughtful demeanor. Wind Whisper was Spark's parent, one of 3 adults who shared responsibility for raising the young hatchling. The Caliph family structure was different from human ones, more communal, more flexible, but no less devoted. They welcomed David into Skyreach with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Some of the Caliph watched him with suspicion, their scales darkening with colors he learned meant wariness or fear. Others approached him with open interest, touching him briefly to share images and sensations, trying to understand this strange being who walked on two legs and wore artificial skin over its soft, vulnerable hide. Through it all, Spark stayed near David, seeming to have claimed him as something between a friend and a curiosity. The hatchling would show him things, touching his hand to share images of Calith life and culture. David saw their art, beautiful sculptures that seemed to shift and change in the light. He saw their food, fruits and fungi that grew in the forest, cultivated with care, but never farmed in ways that would damage the natural balance. He saw their young, dozens of hatchlings like Spark, playing in the lower branches under the watchful eyes of adults. And he saw their fear. When Spark showed him images of humans, they were colored by wariness. The Caliph had watched the colony being built, had seen the machines tear into the earth, had heard the sounds of mining and construction. They didn't understand why humans had come, what they wanted, whether they would be content with the small territory they had claimed, or whether they would expand, pushing into the forests and disrupting the Caliph way of life. David tried to explain, sharing images of Earth and its crowded cities, its exhausted resources, the desperate need for humanity to reach out to the stars. He showed them that humans meant no harm, that they simply sought a new home, a place to grow and thrive. But he could see the doubt in the Caliph's response, feel their uncertainty. Humans said they meant no harm, but their actions spoke of change and disruption. How could the Caliph trust them? It was a question David had no easy answer for. He spent 3 days in Skyreach, 3 days that he knew would cost him dearly when he returned to the colony, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Every hour brought new discoveries, new insights into Caliph culture and biology. He learned that their color-changing scales were more than just emotional displays. They were a form of art and communication combined, capable of expressing concepts that would take humans paragraphs to describe. He learned that their flight wasn't just physical, but almost meditative, a practice that centered their minds and connected them to their world. And he learned that despite all their differences, the Caliph wanted many of the same things humans did: safety for their children, a stable home, the chance to live their lives without fear, understanding from their neighbors. On the third night, sitting on a platform high in the trees with Spark curled asleep in his lap, and the lights of the human colony visible in the distance, David had an idea. It was ambitious, probably impossible, certainly well beyond his authority or expertise, but he couldn't shake it. What if the colony and the Caliph could truly coexist? Not just avoid each other, maintaining a careful distance, but actually work together. Humans needed resources, but they also had technology that could help the Caliph: medical knowledge, material science, communication systems that could connect Caliph communities separated by vast distances. And the Caliph had knowledge of this world that humans desperately needed, understanding of the ecology, the weather patterns, the hidden resources that existed in harmony with nature rather than in opposition to it. It would require trust on both sides, compromise, patience, the willingness to see past differences and find common ground. It would require people to set aside fear and choose hope instead. Wind Whisper landed on the platform beside David, moving with barely a sound. The adult settled next to him, looking out at the human colony lights with an unreadable expression. After a moment, Wind Whisper touched David's shoulder. The image that flowed into David's mind was complex. It showed both species living near each other, not separate but not merged either, maintaining their distinct identities while building bridges of understanding and cooperation. It showed Caliph flying through a sky unburdened by fear of human weapons. It showed humans walking in the forests, welcomed rather than watched with suspicion. It showed children, both Caliph and human, growing up knowing each other as neighbors and friends rather than as strangers or threats. It was a vision of what could be if they were brave enough to try. David felt his throat tighten. "I want that too," he said, knowing Wind Whisper couldn't understand his words, but hoping the emotion would carry through. I don't know how to make it happen, but I want to try. Wind Whisper's scales shifted to colors that David had learned meant determination mixed with hope. The adult reached out and took David's hand, not to share images this time, but simply to hold it. A gesture of solidarity, of partnership, of friendship. In David's lap, Spark stirred and made a small, contented sound. The hatchling's scales glowed with soft colors, even in sleep, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. David looked down at this small creature who had stumbled to his door in a storm, and he realized that Spark had given him something more valuable than first contact or diplomatic opportunities. The hatchling had given him purpose, direction, a reason to believe that the impossible might just be possible after all. "All right," David said softly, to Wind Whisper and Spark and to himself. "Let's change two worlds." The return to the colony was every bit as difficult as David had expected. He was met at the settlement entrance by Security Chief Rodriguez and Colony Administrator Patel, neither of whom looked pleased. His unauthorized departure had been noticed, his vague messages about first contact had been flagged, and his absence of 3 days had triggered protocols that nearly resulted in a search and rescue operation. David stood in the administrator's office and accepted the reprimand with as much grace as he could manage. Yes, he had violated protocols. Yes, he had exceeded his authority. Yes, he had put himself and potentially the entire colony at risk. He didn't try to defend his actions, didn't make excuses. He simply told the truth about what had happened. About Spark knocking on his door, about the Caliph and Skyreach, about the possibility of real, meaningful cooperation between the two species. Patel listened with a face that gave nothing away. Rodriguez looked skeptical, arms crossed, clearly thinking about all the security implications. When David finished, there was a long silence. "You should have called for backup immediately," Rodriguez said. "We have protocols for exactly this kind of situation." "I know," David said. "But if I had, would we have found them? Would they have trusted us? Or would they have simply disappeared deeper into the forest, and we'd be back to watching each other from a distance?" Patel leaned back in her chair, studying David with sharp eyes. "You're asking us to trust your judgment, your feel for a situation that you had no training to handle. You're asking us to build policy around a personal relationship you developed with an alien child." "I'm asking you to see an opportunity," David said. "I'm asking you to imagine what we could accomplish if we worked with the Caliph instead of around them. We're scientists, explorers. We came to the stars to discover new things, to expand human understanding. Well, here's our chance. Here's something bigger than mining operations and resource extraction. Here's the possibility of genuine cultural exchange with an intelligent species. Here's a massive liability and potential security threat," Rodriguez countered. "We know nothing about their capabilities, their intentions, their politics. For all we know, you were manipulated. That hatchling could have been bait, a way to get a human into their territory so they could study us." David couldn't argue with the logic. It was possible. But he thought about Spark's fear in the storm, about Wind Whisper's profound relief at recovering the lost hatchling, about the vision of cooperation that had passed between them on that platform high in the trees. He thought about the care the Caliph had taken not to harm him, the patience they had shown in trying to communicate, the trust they had extended by allowing him into their settlement. "I don't think so," David said quietly. "But even if I'm wrong, even if this is a risk, isn't it a risk worth taking? Isn't this why we came to the stars?" Patel was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. "You've put me in an impossible position, Chen. If I officially sanction what you did, I'm encouraging others to break protocols. If I punish you, I'm potentially destroying the only positive contact we've had with the natives. And if I do nothing, I'm failing in my responsibility to maintain order and safety in this colony." "So what will you do?" David asked. I'm going to make a deal with you, Patel said. You're going to write a detailed report of everything that happened, every observation, every interaction, every piece of information you gathered about the Caliph, and then you're going to help me figure out how to turn your unauthorized adventure into an official first contact initiative. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, with proper protocols, trained personnel, and clear objectives. David felt hope rise in his chest. You're going to pursue contact? I'm going to explore the possibility, Patel corrected, carefully, slowly, with appropriate safeguards. But yes, if what you're saying is true, if there's a genuine opportunity here for cooperation, then it would be irresponsible not to investigate it further. She fixed him with a stern look. Under proper supervision this time. I understand, David said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Patel said. You're still facing disciplinary action for the protocol violations. Nothing severe, but there have to be consequences. Consider yourself on restricted duty for the next month, and you'll be working with our xenology team to prepare for official contact attempts. Think you can handle that? Yes, ma'am, David said, trying to keep the smile off his face and failing. Rodriguez still looked unhappy but nodded. I'll want to review your report from a security perspective. If we're going to have ongoing contact with the Caliph, we need protocols for that too. Safety measures, communication procedures, emergency extraction plans. Of course, David said, whatever you need. As he left the administrator's office, David felt the weight that had been pressing on his chest for 3 days finally lift. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments where it seemed impossible. But they were going to try. The colony was going to reach out to the Caliph, and maybe, just maybe, something wonderful would come from it. He returned to his small housing unit and found something waiting at his door. A small bundle of woven grass, formed into a shape that resembled a bird in flight. Tucked inside was a single scale, iridescent and beautiful, shifting through colors in the light. David picked it up carefully and held it to the light. He didn't need telepathic communication to understand the message. It was a gift, a token of friendship, a promise that he wasn't alone in hoping for something better. He placed the scale carefully on his shelf, next to his photographs from Earth, and began writing his report. The first official contact mission launched 2 weeks later. It was a small team: David, 2 xenologists, a linguist who specialized in nonverbal communication, and Rodriguez himself, who insisted on being present for security reasons. They carried gifts, carefully chosen to be useful without being threatening. Medical supplies, books with pictures of Earth, samples of human art and music. And they carried a message, painstakingly crafted by the linguist and approved by a committee, expressing humanity's desire for peaceful coexistence and mutual understanding. David led them through the forest, following the path he had taken before. The journey felt different with others present, less like an adventure and more like a diplomatic mission. The xenologist chattered excitedly, pointing out details of the forest ecosystem and taking samples when appropriate. The linguist recorded everything, building a database of environmental factors that might influence Caliph communication. Rodriguez stayed alert, hand never far from his weapons, eyes constantly scanning the canopy. When they reached the clearing where David had first met Wind Whisper, he called out in the way Spark had taught him, a rising series of tones that echoed through the forest. For a moment, nothing happened, and David felt doubt creep in. What if the Caliph had decided against contact? What if his welcome had been a one-time courtesy, not an invitation for more? Then Spark dropped from the canopy like a small comet, wings spread wide, chirping joyfully. The hatchling landed directly on David's shoulder, making the xenologist gasp and Rodriguez reach for his weapon before thinking better of it. Spark touched David's face, and a flood of happy images washed through him. Missing him, glad he returned, excited to see him again. "Hello, Spark," David said, laughing as the hatchling's scales rippled through happy colors. I missed you too. I brought friends. Wind Whisper landed next, more gracefully, followed by two other adults David recognized from his first visit. The Caliph studied the humans with evident interest, their scales shifting through colors that David was learning to read. Curiosity, caution, hope. The linguist stepped forward slowly, hands open and empty, in a universal gesture of peace. "This is incredible," she whispered. "David, can they communicate with all of us through touch? Or just you?" "I think anyone," David said, "but it takes practice to send clear images, and receiving can be overwhelming at first." Wind Whisper moved closer to the linguist, studying her with those large golden eyes. After a moment, the Caliph extended a hand. The linguist looked at David, who nodded encouragingly, and then reached out to touch Wind Whisper's hand. Her eyes went wide. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, I see, yes. Hello, we come in peace. We want to understand you, to learn from you. We want to be neighbors, not threats." Whether her thoughts transmitted clearly, or whether Wind Whisper simply sensed her sincerity, David couldn't tell. But the adult's scales shifted to warmer colors, and when Wind Whisper withdrew the touch, the Caliph gestured toward the forest with the same invitation that had been extended to David weeks before. "Come, see, learn." The team spent 6 hours in Skyreach that first day, and every moment was filled with discovery. The xenologists were particularly fascinated by the Caliph's biological adaptations, the way their scales could shift temperature to regulate their body heat, the complex structure of their wings that allowed for both soaring flight and rapid maneuvering. The linguist worked tirelessly to understand the nuances of touch communication, building a framework for eventual translation technology. Rodriguez, for his part, seemed to relax incrementally as the day went on. The Caliph showed no aggression, no territorial defensiveness beyond initial wariness. They were cautious but welcoming, clearly as curious about humans as humans were about them. By the end of the visit, Rodriguez was actually smiling as a young Caliph attempted to explain the concept of wind dancing, an aerial art form that combined flight and color display in intricate patterns. But it was David who had the most important conversation that day. Wind Whisper took him aside, to a quiet platform away from the others, and shared a complex series of images and concepts. The adult showed him Caliph history, generations of peaceful living in these forests, showed him the arrival of humans, the fear and confusion it had caused, showed him debates among the Caliph about what to do, whether to flee deeper into the wilderness or to stay and watch these strange newcomers. And then Wind Whisper showed him something else, a vision of the future, more detailed than before. Caliph and humans working together to understand New Terra's ecosystems, humans helping to treat Caliph illnesses with their advanced medicine, Caliph teaching humans to live in harmony with the forest rather than in opposition to it, children of both species growing up with understanding instead of fear. But woven through this hopeful vision were threads of uncertainty. Other Caliph communities, more isolated, more suspicious of outsiders. The potential for misunderstandings, for accidents that could destroy fragile trust. The challenge of truly understanding beings so fundamentally different from each other. It would be hard, Wind Whisper communicated. It would require patience and courage from both sides. There would be failures and setbacks, but it was possible, if they chose to try. David took Wind Whisper's hand and shared his own vision. Humans spreading through the galaxy, meeting species after species, but never truly connecting with them, always remaining separate, always viewing others as either resources or threats. He showed Wind Whisper how tired he was of that pattern, how desperately he wanted something different. He showed his hope that here, on New Terra, humans and Caliph could create a new model, could prove that different species could not just coexist, but truly thrive together. Wind Whisper's scales rippled with colors that David now recognized as determination and hope intertwined. The Caliph squeezed his hand, And though no images passed between them, the message was clear. We will try together. When the team returned to the colony that evening, they brought with them a formal invitation. The Caliph elders wished to meet with human leadership, to establish boundaries and agreements, to create a framework for coexistence. It was exactly what Patel had hoped for, the beginning of real, structured diplomacy. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of activity. Diplomats arrived from Earth, bringing with them protocols and procedures and enough bureaucracy to drown in. Scientists established research stations in the forest, always with Caliph permission and oversight. Trade began, small at first, but growing. Human medical technology for Caliph ecological knowledge, human materials for Caliph art, human food for Caliph music. There were challenges, misunderstandings that threatened to derail everything. A human mining crew that accidentally disrupted a Caliph sacred site, causing outrage that took weeks to smooth over. A Caliph hunting party that frightened a human surveying team, leading to a tense standoff that was only resolved through careful mediation. Each incident was a test, a moment where the fragile peace could have shattered. But each time, people on both sides chose understanding over fear, chose communication over conflict, chose to believe in the possibility of something better. The turning point came 7 months after Spark knocked on David's door. A disease struck the colony, something native to New Terra that human immune systems had no defense against. 3 people died before the medical team could even identify the pathogen. Panic spread through the colony as more people fell ill. Quarantine protocols were implemented, but they couldn't stop the disease from spreading. And then the Caliph arrived. Wind Whisper led a delegation of healers, carrying with them plants and fungi that grew deep in the forest. They had seen this disease before, had learned over generations how to treat it. Through careful communication, mixing Caliph traditional medicine with human medical technology, they found a treatment. Within 2 weeks, the outbreak was contained. Within a month, every infected person had recovered. The colony held a celebration, and for the first time, Caliph were invited as guests of honor. Humans and Caliph mingled in the settlement square, sharing food and stories and laughter that needed no translation. Children of both species played together, chasing each other through the crowd with joyful abandon. David watched it all and felt tears prick his eyes. Spark, now noticeably larger than when they had first met, perched on his shoulder and touched his cheek. The hatchling's communication had become more sophisticated with practice, the images clearer and more complex. But the feeling that came through was simple. Happy, family, home. Yeah, David said, his voice rough with emotion. Me too, Spark. Me too. Later that night, after the celebration had wound down and most people had returned to their homes, David stood at his window watching the lights of Skyreach twinkle in the forest. Patel found him there, carrying 2 glasses of the terrible synthetic wine that was all the colony could produce. Thinking deep thoughts? She asked, handing him a glass. Thinking about how close we came to never having this, David said. If Spark had knocked on someone else's door, if I had followed protocols and called security instead of letting the hatchling in, if you had decided the risk was too great and shut down contact attempts, so many ways this could have gone wrong. But it didn't, Patel said. You took a risk, David. A huge, irresponsible, completely unauthorized risk. And it paid off in ways none of us could have imagined. She paused, sipping her wine and grimacing at the taste. I got a communication from Earth today. They want to hold you up as an example. The human who made first contact, who bridged the gap between species. They're talking about awards, commendations, maybe even a position in the newly forming Interspecies Relations Department. David turned to look at her. What did you tell them? I told them you're still on restricted duty for protocol violations, Patel said with a slight smile, but that when your punishment period is over, they're welcome to try to recruit you. What do you think? Ready to become a professional bridge builder? David looked back out at the forest, at the lights of Skyreach, at the evidence of two worlds coming together. He thought about Spark and Wind Whisper, and all the other Calith he had come to know. He thought about the children, human and Calith, who would grow up in a world where cooperation between species was normal rather than exceptional. He thought about the future that was unfolding, day by day, built on a foundation of trust and understanding, and the simple act of opening a door to someone in need. "I think," he said slowly, "that I'd rather stay here, keep working with the Caliph, help make sure this experiment succeeds. There are going to be more challenges, more problems to solve, and I want to be here to help solve them." Patel nodded as if she had expected that answer. "Good, because frankly, we need you here. The Caliph trust you in a way they don't trust anyone else yet. You're the bridge, David, the living proof that this can work." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights and sipping terrible wine, while outside the window, two worlds continued their slow, careful dance toward a shared future. 3 years after Spark knocked on David's door, the joint colony of Skyreach New Terra was thriving. Human buildings and Calith tree structures intermingled, creating a settlement that was unlike anything else in human space. The population had grown to 300 humans and an estimated 500 Calith, though the Calith didn't count themselves in quite the same way humans did, thinking more in terms of family groups than individuals. David walked through the market district, a space where both species came to trade and socialize. Human vendors sold earth foods and manufactured goods. Calith artisans offered their color-changing sculptures and wind chimes that sang with alien melodies. Children of both species ran between the stalls, playing games that mixed human and Calith traditions into something entirely new. Spark, now a young adult with scales that shimmered like jewels and wings that could carry the Calith for miles without tiring, landed beside David with practiced grace. The Calith had taken an official position as a cultural liaison, helping to bridge the communication gap between the species. But to David, Spark would always be the lost hatchling who had stumbled to his door in a storm, changing everything. "The new students arrived from Earth today," Spark communicated through touch, the images now flowing with the ease of long practice. 25 of them, here to study Calith language and culture. The teachers are excited but nervous. "The teachers are always nervous when new humans arrive," David said with a smile. "They're afraid the newcomers will be clumsy and disrespectful. And they're always right, but the students learn." "As we all do," Spark agreed. "Wind Whisper asked me to remind you about tonight's council meeting. There are decisions to be made about the northern expansion." The colony was growing, and with growth came complications. More humans wanted to come to New Terra, drawn by stories of successful coexistence with an alien species. But expansion meant encroaching further into Calith territory, potentially disrupting communities that had lived there for generations. It was a delicate balance, requiring careful negotiation and compromise from both sides. "I'll be there," David said. "How's Wind Whisper doing? I haven't seen them in a few days." Spark's scales shifted to colors that indicated amusement. "Busy with the new hatchlings. 3 eggs hatched last week, and you know how demanding newborns can be." David did know. He had helped care for several Caliph hatchlings over the past few years, learning the intricacies of their development and needs. In return, Caliph had helped human parents understand how to raise children in New Terra's unique environment. It was one of the many small exchanges that built trust and understanding. As they walked, David noticed a group of young humans in Calith gathered around a projection screen. They were watching something that made them laugh and cheer. A collaborative art project, David realized, where human animation technology was used to bring Calith color stories to life in new ways. It was beautiful, a perfect synthesis of two different approaches to art. "Do you ever regret it?" Spark asked suddenly. "That night when I knocked on your door? You could have ignored me, could have followed your protocols. Your life would be simpler." David stopped walking and turned to face his friend. Do you remember what you felt that night when you were lost in the storm? Spark's scales darkened slightly. Fear, cold, certainty that I would die. And do you remember what you felt when I opened the door? The colors shifted again, warming. Hope, relief, safety. That's what you gave me too, David said. Not that night, but in the days and months that followed. I came to New Terra thinking I was searching for resources, for a place for humanity to expand. But what I really needed was purpose, connection, the knowledge that what I was doing mattered in a way that went beyond resource extraction and colony quotas. You gave me that spark. You and Wind Whisper and all the Caliph. You gave me a reason to believe that humanity could be more than what we had been. Spark reached out and took David's hand, and for a moment they simply stood there, human and Caliph, friends bound by a connection that transcended species. We gave each other hope, Spark said finally, and from that hope, we built all of this. David looked around at the market, at the mingled architecture, at the children playing together without regard for whether their companions had scales or skin. He thought about the medical advances that had come from combining human and Caliph knowledge, the ecological restoration projects that were healing parts of New Terra damaged by early human mining, the art and music and stories that were emerging from the fusion of two cultures. And he thought about Earth, and the reports that came regularly now about other human colonies trying to replicate the New Terra model, about first contact situations being approached with more care and openness, with the understanding that other intelligent species were potential partners rather than obstacles or resources. The change was slow, and there were failures and setbacks, but it was happening. Two worlds had changed because a lost hatchling knocked on a door, and a human had chosen to answer. "Come on," David said, squeezing Spark's hand gently. "We have a council meeting to get to, and I heard there's going to be a proposal to establish a joint university. That's going to be a fight." "Everything worthwhile is a fight," Spark said with amusement coloring their scales. "But at least we fight together now." They walked toward the council building, human and Caliph side by side, while around them the colony hummed with life and possibility. The future was uncertain, as it always was. There would be more challenges, more problems to solve, more moments where the fragile peace would be tested. But there would also be more moments like this, more friendships forged across the gulf of biology and culture, more children growing up with the understanding that differences were something to celebrate rather than fear, more reasons to believe that among all the vast and terrible darkness of space, connection was possible, understanding was possible, hope was possible. Somewhere in the colony, another lost soul might knock on a door, and somewhere, someone would have the courage to answer. And maybe, just maybe, two more worlds would begin to change. The story that started with a knock on a door in a storm continued, written now by hundreds of hands and claws, by thousands of choices made day after day to choose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair. And it was only just beginning.